The swamp stretched endlessly under a sky painted in hues of gray and green. Its surface shimmered unnaturally, glowing faintly with an eerie luminescence that seemed alive. It was not water beneath the thin crust of algae, but something far more sinister, a toxic brew that could melt flesh from bone within seconds. Few dared to venture near it, let alone cross it. Yet Cale had no choice. Cale moved cautiously along the edge of the swamp, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, damp earth. His face was streaked with dirt, evidence of days spent scavenging for scraps in this unforgiving wasteland. He tightened his grip on the rusted metal pole he carried, using it as both a walking stick and a weapon against whatever predators lurked nearby. Hunger gnawed at him constantly, but survival came first. Always. As he scanned the horizon, his eyes caught movement, or rather, stillness where there shouldn't have been any. Something, or someone, was floating face down in the swamp, partially submerged in the glowing muck. At first glance, it looked like debris, perhaps a piece of discarded machinery or a tree limb swept away by one of the frequent storms. But then he saw it, a pale hand, fingers curled loosely as if reaching for help even in death. Cale froze, torn between instinct and reason. Helping anyone here was suicide. Every drop of liquid in that swamp was poison, corrosive enough to eat through steel. Even standing too close risked inhaling fumes that could leave you choking for air. And yet, something about the sight tugged at him. A memory, maybe. An old story his mother used to tell before she disappeared during one of the great purges. She'd always said that sometimes doing the right thing meant risking everything. He cursed under his breath, shaking his head. "You're a fool," he muttered aloud, knowing full well he couldn't just walk away. Taking a deep breath, he tied a rag around his nose and mouth to filter out some of the fumes. Then, gripping his pole tightly, he stepped closer to the edge of the swamp. The ground squelched beneath his feet, and he winced as he felt the dampness seep through his soles. One wrong step, and he'd join whoever lay in the swamp. Carefully, he extended the pole toward the figure, hooking it under what appeared to be an arm clad in strange armor. The material gleamed faintly despite being coated in slime, its design unlike anything Cale had ever seen. It wasn't standard issue gear. It looked almost ancient. With every ounce of strength he possessed, Cale pulled. The body resisted at first, caught in the thick sludge. But slowly, inch by agonizing inch, it began to move. Sweat dripped down his forehead, mixing with the grime already covering his skin. His muscles burned, screaming for relief, but he refused to let go. Finally, after what felt like hours, the figure broke free of the swamp's grip and collapsed onto solid ground with a wet thud. Cale staggered back, gasping for breath. His arms trembled from the effort, and his legs threatened to give way beneath him. For a moment, he simply stared at the prone form, unsure whether he'd just saved a life or dragged a corpse out of the muck. The person was a woman, her long hair plastered to her face and neck, strands clinging to the contours of her cheekbones. Her armor, though filthy, bore intricate carvings etched into its surface, symbols that glowed faintly, pulsing with a light that seemed to come from within. Cale frowned, leaning closer to examine them. They were unfamiliar, almost otherworldly, and they sent a shiver running down his spine. "Who are you?" he whispered, brushing aside a strand of hair to check for signs of life. Beneath the grime, her features were sharp yet delicate, her lips parted slightly as if caught mid-breath. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, shallow but steady. Relief washed over Cale. She was alive. But why? How had she ended up in the swamp? And who, or what, was she? Cale hesitated, torn between curiosity and caution. Leaving her here would mean certain death. Staying put wasn't much safer. The swamp was home to all manner of horrors, from mutated beasts to roving gangs of scavengers who wouldn't hesitate to kill for a scrap of food. Still, dragging her back to his shelter would slow him down significantly and draw unwanted attention. Yet as he gazed at her again, something stirred inside him. There was something about those glowing symbols, something hauntingly familiar. Maybe it was superstition talking, or maybe it was sheer exhaustion clouding his judgment. Whatever it was, Cale made up his mind. Grunting with effort, he hoisted her limp body over his shoulder, wincing as her weight settled awkwardly across his frame. Each step back toward his hideout felt heavier than the last, but he pressed on, driven by a mix of stubbornness and hope. Hope that saving her might somehow change his luck. Hope that she might hold answers to questions he didn't even know how to ask. By the time he reached his makeshift shelter, a crumbling shack hidden among jagged rocks, he was drenched in sweat and trembling with fatigue. Gently, he laid her down on a pile of rags that served as his bed. As he did, his fingers brushed against the glowing symbols once more, and a strange warmth spread through his palm, fleeting but undeniable. For now, all he could do was wait and wonder what tomorrow would bring, and whether he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. The air inside Cale's shelter was thick with the scent of damp earth and rusted metal. The tiny space, barely large enough to fit 2 people, was dimly lit by a flickering lantern fueled by scavenged oil. Its faint glow cast dancing shadows on the cracked walls, creating an eerie atmosphere that matched the uncertainty weighing heavily on Cale's mind. For 3 days, the mysterious woman had lain motionless on his makeshift bed. Her breathing remained shallow but steady, her body eerily still except for the occasional twitch of her fingers. Cale spent most of his time watching over her, torn between hope and fear. He knew nothing about her, not her name, her origins, or why she'd been floating in the toxic swamp. All he had were questions, and the glowing symbols on her armor only deepened the mystery. On the 4th day, something changed. Cale was hunched over a small fire outside the shelter, trying to boil water for what little food he had left when he heard a soft groan from within. His heart skipped a beat. Dropping the pot, he scrambled back inside, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste. The woman stirred weakly, her eyelids fluttering, as if fighting against the weight of exhaustion. Her lips parted, forming silent words before she finally opened her eyes. They were unlike anything Cale had ever seen. Bright and piercing, they seemed to shimmer with an inner light, like stars trapped behind glass. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She stared at him, confusion etched across her face, while Cale stood frozen, unsure whether to feel relief or alarm. "Where?" Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. She tried to sit up, but her body betrayed her, collapsing back onto the rags with a pained grunt. "You're safe," Cale said quickly, instinctively raising his hands to calm her. "For now, anyway." She blinked slowly, taking in her surroundings. Her gaze lingered on the glowing symbols on her armor, which pulsed faintly even in the dim light. Recognition flashed in her eyes, followed by a shadow of sorrow. She turned her attention back to Cale, studying him intently. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice stronger this time. "My name's Cale," he replied, shifting uncomfortably under her scrutiny. "I found you in the swamp. You were sinking. I pulled you out." Her brow furrowed, and she closed her eyes as if piecing together fragments of memory. "The swamp," she murmured. "Yes, I remember now. They were chasing me. The Iron Veil." "The Iron Veil," Cale echoed, frowning. The name sounded familiar, though he couldn't place it. "What's that?" Her eyes snapped open, sharp and alert despite her weakened state. "A faction," she said grimly. "Powerful. Ruthless. They hunt those who defy them, or those they think can be used." Cale swallowed hard, suddenly wishing he hadn't gotten involved. "And they were after you." She nodded, her expression darkening. "They want what I am. What I can do." She paused, glancing down at her hands. When she looked up again, there was a mixture of defiance and weariness in her gaze. "My name is Lyra. I've been running for longer than you can imagine." Cale didn't know how to respond. This woman, Lyra, was clearly no ordinary survivor. Everything about her screamed danger, from her strange armor to the haunted look in her eyes. Yet here she was, vulnerable and dependent on him. It made no sense. "What exactly are you?" he asked cautiously, unable to keep the curiosity out of his voice. Lyra hesitated, as if debating how much to reveal. Finally, she sighed. "A relic of another time," she said softly. "A warrior created to fight wars that ended centuries ago. But some things never truly die." Cale stared at her, unsure whether to believe her words or dismiss them as delirium. Before he could press further, Lyra shifted slightly, wincing as pain shot through her limbs. Her movements caused one of the glowing symbols on her armor to flare brighter, illuminating the cramped space with an ethereal glow. "What's wrong with your armor?" Cale asked, pointing hesitantly at the markings. "It's not just armor," Lyra corrected, her tone tinged with both pride and sadness. "It's part of me. Enhanced reflexes, heightened senses, energy manipulation. These symbols are conduits for abilities far beyond human limits." Cale's jaw dropped. Energy manipulation. Abilities beyond human limits. It sounded like something out of old legends, tales told around campfires to scare children. And yet, looking at Lyra, he couldn't deny the truth in her words. There was something otherworldly about her, something ancient and powerful. To prove her point, Lyra raised a trembling hand. With visible effort, she focused on the lantern sitting nearby. Slowly, its flame began to dance erratically, growing brighter and hotter until it nearly consumed the wick. Then, with a flick of her wrist, the flame returned to its normal size, leaving Cale gaping in astonishment. "How did you?" he stammered, unable to finish the sentence. "A gift and a curse," Lyra interrupted, lowering her hand. "But my powers aren't limitless. Using them drains me, especially now." Cale nodded slowly, processing everything she'd said. Despite her weakened state, Lyra exuded an aura of strength and resilience that commanded respect. Still, doubts lingered in his mind. Helping her came with risks he wasn't sure he could afford. Before he could voice his concerns, Lyra spoke again. "Why did you save me, Cale? Most would have left me to die." The question caught him off guard. Why had he saved her? Compassion? Curiosity? Or maybe a desperate hope that doing so might somehow change his luck in this unforgiving world? "I don't know," he admitted after a long pause. "Maybe because no one deserves to drown in that thing." Lyra studied him for a moment, her piercing eyes searching his face for any hint of deception. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she gave a small, grateful nod. "Thank you," she said simply. "You may not realize it, but you've done more than save a life today. You've given me a chance to fight back." Her words sent a chill down Cale's spine. Fight back against whom? The Iron Veil. And what role would he play in all of this? He wanted to ask, but Lyra's eyelids were already drooping, exhaustion overtaking her once more. Within moments, she drifted back into unconsciousness, leaving Cale alone with his thoughts. As the hours passed, Cale found himself pacing restlessly. Every creak of the wind outside made him jump. Every shadow seemed darker than before. The Iron Veil, if they were real, wouldn't stop searching for her. And if they found her here, they'd find him too. Yet despite the danger, Cale couldn't shake the feeling that meeting Lyra was no accident. Whether it was fate, coincidence, or sheer stupidity, their paths had crossed for a reason. And deep down, he knew he wouldn't turn away now, not when she needed him. And not when the answers she carried might hold the key to understanding the chaos that had consumed their world. The days that followed were a blur of tension and discovery. Cale spent much of his time scavenging for supplies, leaving Lyra to rest and regain her strength. Though she was still weak, her recovery was remarkable, far faster than any ordinary person's would have been. Each morning, Cale returned to find her sitting upright, inspecting the glowing symbols on her armor or practicing small movements with her hands. She seemed determined to reclaim control over her body, even if it meant pushing herself to the brink of collapse. Their interactions were cautious at first. Lyra spoke little about her past, offering only vague hints about the battles she'd fought and the lives she'd saved or taken. Cale, too, kept his guard up, unsure how much he could trust her. Yet as the days passed, their shared isolation began to break down the walls between them. One evening, as twilight painted the horizon in shades of orange and purple, Cale returned to the shelter carrying a bundle of dried roots and a few tins of preserved food he'd found in an abandoned bunker. Lyra was sitting outside, leaning against the rocky wall of the hideout. Her eyes were closed, but she opened them as he approached, her gaze sharp and alert. "Find anything good?" she asked, her voice steadier now. "Enough to keep us going for a while," Cale replied, setting the items down. "But we can't stay here forever. The swamp isn't exactly safe, and neither is this place." Lyra nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. The Iron Veil won't stop looking for me. And when they come, they'll bring everything they've got." Cale frowned, crouching beside her. "Why are they after you? What do they want?" Her expression darkened, and for a moment she hesitated. Then she sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "It's complicated. My abilities, they're tied to something ancient, something powerful. The Iron Veil wants to harness that power, to use it as a weapon." "A weapon?" Cale echoed, his stomach sinking. "And what happens to you if they succeed?" "They don't need me alive to make it work," Lyra said bluntly. "Just my essence, my energy." She glanced down at her hands, flexing her fingers absently. "They'd been hunting people like me for years. Most didn't survive." Cale stared at her, a mixture of pity and anger rising in his chest. "People like you. How many are there?" "Not many," Lyra admitted. "Maybe none left except me." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Cale couldn't imagine what it must feel like to be the last of your kind, hunted relentlessly by those who saw you as nothing more than a tool. He wanted to say something comforting, but no words came. Instead, he busied himself unpacking the supplies, trying to distract himself from the growing sense of dread. As night fell, they sat together by the fire, sharing a meal of boiled roots and stale crackers. The silence between them was comfortable now, broken only by the crackling flames and the distant hum of insects. Despite their differences, Cale found himself drawn to Lyra, not just out of obligation or curiosity, but because she reminded him of something he'd long forgotten: hope. "You know this world better than I do," Lyra said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "Tell me about it." Cale blinked, surprised by the request. "What do you mean?" "The wasteland, the swamps, the ruins, everything. I've been absent for a long time. Things have changed." Cale hesitated, then began to speak. He told her about the endless storms that ravaged the land, the toxic swamps that spread like cancer, and the scattered groups of survivors struggling to eke out a living. He described the gangs that preyed on the weak, the scavengers who risked their lives for scraps, and the factions like the Iron Veil that ruled through fear and force. Lyra listened intently, her brow furrowed as if piecing together fragments of a puzzle. When Cale finished, she nodded slowly. "This world has suffered greatly," she murmured, "but it's not beyond saving." Cale snorted, shaking his head. "Saving? From what? There's nothing left to save." "There's always something worth fighting for," Lyra countered firmly. "Even in the darkest times, there's light. You just have to look for it." Her conviction caught him off guard. After years of surviving on scraps and dodging death, Cale had stopped believing in grand ideals or noble causes. Survival was all that mattered, and even that felt like a gamble. But Lyra's unwavering determination stirred something deep within him, a spark of defiance he hadn't felt in years. Over the next few days, their bond grew stronger. Lyra began teaching Cale basic self-defense techniques, showing him how to anticipate an opponent's moves and strike with precision. Though she was still recovering, her skill was undeniable, and Kale quickly realized how much he had to learn. In return, he taught her about the modern wasteland, the dangers, the shortcuts, and the tricks for staying alive. Their lessons became a routine, a way to pass the time and prepare for whatever lay ahead. One afternoon, as they practiced near the edge of the swamp, Kale noticed something unusual. A faint buzzing sound filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. His heart sank as he recognized it immediately. Drones. Surveillance drones used by the Iron Veil to scout for targets. "Get down," Kale hissed, pulling Lyra behind a cluster of rocks. They crouched low, watching as two sleek, metallic drones swept overhead, their red lights scanning the ground below. Lyra clenched her fists, her jaw tightening with barely contained rage. "They're getting closer," she whispered, her voice cold. "We can't stay here." "No kidding," Kale muttered, his mind racing. "If they spot us, we're dead." The drones hovered for a moment longer before moving on, disappearing into the distance. But their presence was a clear warning. The Iron Veil knew they were nearby. It was only a matter of time before they sent ground troops. "We need to move," Lyra said, standing up. "Now." Kale nodded reluctantly. Leaving the relative safety of the hideout was risky, but staying put was suicide. Together, they gathered their meager belongings and set off into the wilderness, heading deeper into the treacherous terrain. The journey was grueling, with every step bringing new challenges: jagged cliffs, hidden sinkholes, and predatory creatures lurking in the shadows. Despite the hardships, Kale found himself relying on Lyra more than he expected. Her knowledge of combat proved invaluable during encounters with hostile wildlife, while her resilience inspired him to push through fatigue and fear. In turn, Lyra depended on Kale's resourcefulness and familiarity with the environment, trusting his instincts when navigating unfamiliar territory. "They don't need me alive to make it work," Lyra said bluntly. "Just my essence, my energy." She glanced down at her hands, flexing her fingers absently. "They've been hunting people like me for years. Most didn't survive." Kale stared at her, a mixture of pity and anger rising in his chest. "People like you. How many are there?" "Not many," Lyra admitted. "Maybe none left except me." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Kale couldn't imagine what it must feel like to be the last of your kind, hunted relentlessly by those who saw you as nothing more than a tool. He wanted to say something comforting, but no words came. Instead, he busied himself unpacking the supplies, trying to distract himself from the growing sense of dread. As night fell, they sat together by the fire, sharing a meal of boiled roots and stale crackers. The silence between them was comfortable now, broken only by the crackling flames and the distant hum of insects. Despite their differences, Kale found himself drawn to Lyra, not just out of obligation or curiosity, but because she reminded him of something he'd long forgotten: hope. "You know this world better than I do," Lyra said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "Tell me about it." Kale blinked, surprised by the request. "What do you mean?" "The wasteland, the swamps, the ruins, everything. I've been absent for a long time. Things have changed." Kale hesitated, then began to speak. He told her about the endless storms that ravaged the land, the toxic swamps that spread like cancer, and the scattered groups of survivors struggling to eke out a living. He described the gangs that preyed on the weak, the scavengers who risked their lives for scraps, and the factions like the Iron Veil that ruled through fear and force. Lyra listened intently, her brow furrowed as if piecing together fragments of a puzzle. When Kale finished, she nodded slowly. "This world has suffered greatly," she murmured, "but it's not beyond saving." Kale snorted, shaking his head. "Saving? From what? There's nothing left to save." "There's always something worth fighting for," Lyra countered firmly. "Even in the darkest times, there's light. You just have to look for it." Her conviction caught him off guard. After years of surviving on scraps and dodging death, Kale had stopped believing in grand ideals or noble causes. Survival was all that mattered, and even that felt like a gamble. But Lyra's unwavering determination stirred something deep within him, a spark of defiance he hadn't felt in years. Over the next few days, their bond grew stronger. Lyra began teaching Kale basic self-defense techniques, showing him how to anticipate an opponent's moves and strike with precision. Though she was still recovering, her skill was undeniable, and Kale quickly realized how much he had to learn. In return, he taught her about the modern wasteland, the dangers, the shortcuts, and the tricks for staying alive. Their lessons became a routine, a way to pass the time and prepare for whatever lay ahead. One afternoon, as they practiced near the edge of the swamp, Kale noticed something unusual. A faint buzzing sound filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. His heart sank as he recognized it immediately. Drones. Surveillance drones used by the Iron Veil to scout for targets. "Get down," Kale hissed, pulling Lyra behind a cluster of rocks. They crouched low, watching as two sleek, metallic drones swept overhead, their red lights scanning the ground below. Lyra clenched her fists, her jaw tightening with barely contained rage. "They're getting closer," she whispered, her voice cold. "We can't stay here." "No kidding," Kale muttered, his mind racing. "If they spot us, we're dead." The drones hovered for a moment longer before moving on, disappearing into the distance. But their presence was a clear warning. The Iron Veil knew they were nearby. It was only a matter of time before they sent ground troops. "We need to move," Lyra said, standing up. "Now." Kale nodded reluctantly. Leaving the relative safety of the hideout was risky, but staying put was suicide. Together, they gathered their meager belongings and set off into the wilderness, heading deeper into the treacherous terrain. The journey was grueling, with every step bringing new challenges: jagged cliffs, hidden sinkholes, and predatory creatures lurking in the shadows. Despite the hardships, Kale found himself relying on Lyra more than he expected. Her knowledge of combat proved invaluable during encounters with hostile wildlife, while her resilience inspired him to push through fatigue and fear. In turn, Lyra depended on Kale's resourcefulness and familiarity with the environment, trusting his instincts when navigating unfamiliar territory. As they traveled, Kale began to notice subtle changes in Lyra. She laughed more often now, her laughter soft but genuine. She teased him about his clumsy attempts at stealth and praised him when he made progress in their training sessions. It was strange, almost surreal, to see glimpses of humanity beneath her hardened exterior. And yet, those moments made her seem less like a legendary warrior and more like a person. One night, as they camped beneath a canopy of stars, Kale finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been gnawing at him for days. "Lyra," he began hesitantly, "why did you keep fighting? All those years, against impossible odds. Why didn't you give up?" She was silent for a long moment, staring up at the sky. When she spoke, her voice was soft but resolute. "Because giving up means letting them win. And I refuse to let anyone take away the future. Not mine, not yours, not anyone else's." Her words struck a chord deep within Kale. For so long, he'd lived day by day, focusing only on survival. But listening to Lyra, he realized there was more to life than just enduring. Maybe, just maybe, they could fight back, not just for themselves, but for everyone trapped in this broken world. And with that realization, their partnership transformed. No longer were they simply two strangers thrown together by fate. They were allies, bound by a shared purpose and a growing trust. Whatever dangers lay ahead, they would face them together. The journey deeper into the wasteland was grueling, each step taking Kale and Lyra further from familiar territory. The landscape shifted dramatically as they moved. Rolling hills of ash gave way to jagged cliffs, and the air grew colder with every mile. Despite their determination, fatigue began to weigh heavily on them both. Supplies dwindled, and the constant threat of discovery by the Iron Veil kept their nerves stretched thin. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of gray and violet, they stumbled upon something unexpected. An entrance to a hidden ruin buried beneath layers of acidic mud. It was partially concealed by overgrown vines and crumbling stone, but the faint glow emanating from cracks in the earth caught Lyra's sharp eyes. She stopped abruptly, her gaze fixed on the ground. "What is it?" Cale asked, noticing her sudden stillness. "Something old," Lyra replied, kneeling to inspect the area. Her fingers brushed against the moss-covered surface of a weathered slab, revealing intricate carvings beneath. "This isn't natural. Someone built this." Cale frowned, glancing around nervously. "Do you think it's safe? Could be booby-trapped or unstable." "It's worth the risk," Lyra said firmly, standing up. "If these ruins are what I think they are, they might hold answers. About me, about the Iron Veil, maybe even about how to stop them." Her conviction left little room for argument. Reluctantly, Cale helped clear away debris, revealing a narrow passageway leading underground. The air that wafted out was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of rust and decay. They exchanged a glance before descending cautiously into the darkness. Inside, the ruins were eerily silent, save for the occasional drip of water echoing through the corridors. Faint bioluminescent fungi clung to the walls, casting just enough light to guide their way. As they ventured deeper, they discovered remnants of advanced technology long abandoned. Control panels covered in dust, holographic displays flickering weakly, and shattered glass cases containing fragments of ancient artifacts. Eventually, they reached a large chamber dominated by a central console. The device hummed softly, its surface etched with symbols similar to those glowing on Lyra's armor. She approached it slowly, her hand hovering above the controls as if afraid to touch them. This is part of my origin," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I knew legends spoke of experiments, but I never imagined." "What kind of experiments?" Cale asked, stepping closer. His curiosity outweighed his unease, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were intruding on something sacred or dangerous. Lyra hesitated, then activated the console. A hologram sprang to life, projecting images into the air. The footage showed rows of armored figures standing motionless, their bodies connected to machines via glowing cables. Scientists in white coats moved among them, monitoring readings and adjusting settings. The scene shifted to show one figure breaking free from its restraints, unleashing waves of energy that tore through the facility. "They called us living weapons," Lyra explained, her tone heavy with sorrow. "Created to fight wars without end, programmed to destroy anything in our path. But we weren't meant to survive. Not truly. Once the battles were done, they tried to dispose of us." Cale stared at the hologram, his chest tightening. He had always thought of warriors as heroes, but this was monstrous. "And you escaped." "Some of us did," Lyra admitted. "We scattered, hiding wherever we could. Over time, most were hunted down and eliminated. I spent centuries running, fighting, trying to stay alive while searching for a way to undo what was done to me." Her words sent a chill down Cal's spine. Centuries. She wasn't just a relic of another era. She was practically immortal. Yet instead of awe, Cale felt pity. For the burden she carried, for the loneliness she must have endured. Before he could respond, the hologram changed again, displaying schematics of a machine unlike anything Cal had ever seen. It pulsed with energy, its core resembling the swirling vortex of light. Text scrolled across the bottom of the projection, detailing its purpose, a device capable of amplifying the powers of living weapons like Lyra, but at a terrible cost. It drained their essence until nothing remained. "That's what the Iron Veil wants," Lyra said grimly. "They're trying to rebuild it. If they succeed, they'll use it to create an army, a force unstoppable by any means." "And you're the key," Cale realized, his voice barely above a whisper. "Without you, they can't finish it." Lyra nodded, her expression grim. Which is why I can't let them find me. Not here, not anywhere. A tense silence fell between them as the weight of her revelation settled in. Kel's mind raced, grappling with the implications. Everything they'd faced so far, the drones, the relentless pursuit, the danger lurking around every corner, was because of what Lyra was. And yet, despite the enormity of her role, she didn't seem invincible. She was human, in her own way, burdened by guilt and haunted by memories of battles fought and lives lost. "We'll stop them," Cale said finally, surprising even himself with the conviction in his voice. "Together." Lyra turned to him, her piercing eyes searching his face. For a moment, she looked uncertain, as if doubting whether anyone could truly understand the magnitude of what she carried. Then, slowly, she nodded. Together. Their resolve renewed, they continued exploring the ruins, gathering whatever information they could. Among the debris, Cale discovered blueprints for a prototype weapon designed to disrupt energy fields. Though incomplete, the designs offered hope, a potential countermeasure against the Iron Veil's advancements. He tucked the papers carefully into his pack, determined to put them to use when the time came. As they prepared to leave the chamber, Lyra paused, her hand resting on the console. "There's more here than just secrets," she murmured. "This place holds echoes of the past, reminders of who we once were and what we became. We need to remember, Cale. Remember so we don't repeat the same mistakes." He nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. The ruins weren't just a repository of knowledge. They were a testament to humanity's capacity for both creation and destruction. Leaving felt like abandoning a piece of history, but staying would mean certain death. With one last glance at the hologram, now fading into static, they turned and retraced their steps toward the surface. Outside, the night was quiet, the stars obscured by thick clouds. Cale glanced at Lyra, her silhouette illuminated faintly by the moonlight. There was steel in her gaze now, a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it head-on, armed with the truths uncovered in the depths below, and the unshakable bond forged between them. The days following their discovery in the ruins passed in a blur of tension and preparation. Cale and Lyra had barely escaped the underground chamber before signs of activity above ground forced them to flee. A patrol of Iron Veil scouts combing the area, likely drawn by the faint energy signals emitted by the ancient technology they'd uncovered. They moved quickly, putting as much distance between themselves and the ruins as possible. But no matter how far they traveled, the shadow of betrayal loomed closer than either of them realized. One evening, as they made camp beneath the skeletal remains of an old factory, Lyra noticed something unusual. The air felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. Even the scavenger birds that usually circled overhead were absent. Her instincts screamed danger, but she couldn't pinpoint the source. "We're being watched," she whispered to Cale, her hand resting on the hilt of a makeshift blade he'd fashioned for her out of scrap metal. Cale nodded, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond their small fire. "I feel it too. Stay sharp." They sat in silence, listening intently for any sign of movement. Minutes stretched into hours, and just as exhaustion began to creep in, a voice called out from the shadows. "You can come out now. We know you're there." Lyra tensed, rising slowly to her feet. From the edges of the ruined factory emerged a group of people. Ebles, judging by their patched-up uniforms and mismatched weapons. Their leader stepped forward, a tall man with piercing green eyes and a scar running down his left cheek. He held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "We mean you no harm," he said, his tone calm but firm. "We've been tracking you for days. You're not alone anymore." Cale exchanged a wary glance with Lyra. Trust didn't come easily in this world, especially when strangers appeared out of nowhere claiming goodwill. Still, they were outnumbered, and fighting wasn't an option if they wanted to survive. "Who are you?" Cale asked, his voice steady despite the unease twisting in his gut. "My name is Rin," the man replied. And these are my people. We're part of the Free Hand, a resistance group fighting against the Iron Veil. We heard rumors about someone matching your description." His gaze shifted to Lyra, narrowing slightly. "A warrior from another time. The living weapon." Lyra stiffened, her fingers tightening around her blade. "How do you know that?" Rin smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Legends have a way of surviving, even in the darkest times, and we've seen enough evidence to know those legends aren't just stories." For a moment, neither side moved. Then Rin lowered his weapon, signaling for his followers to do the same. "Look, I understand why you're cautious, but we're on the same side. The Iron Veil wants to destroy everything we hold dear, and so do you. Let us help you." It was a tempting offer. After weeks of running and hiding, the idea of allies was almost too good to be true. Yet something about Rin's demeanor unsettled Lyra. There was a coldness behind his smile, a calculation that hinted at ulterior motives. She glanced at Kale, silently asking for his input. "What do you want from us?" Kale asked, stepping forward cautiously. "Information," Rin replied without hesitation. "You've seen things we haven't. Technology, strategies, weaknesses. Share what you know, and we'll protect you." Kale hesitated, torn between hope and suspicion. Before he could respond, Lyra spoke up. "And what happens if we refuse?" Rin's expression hardened, and for a brief moment, the mask of friendliness slipped. "Then we take what we need. By force, if necessary." The threat hung heavy in the air. Lyra's grip on her blade tightened further, and Kale instinctively positioned himself between her and the rebels. For several tense seconds, it seemed as though violence might erupt. But then, Rin raised his hands again, backing away slightly. "Relax," he said, forcing a chuckle. "No one has to get hurt. We're all trying to survive here. Work with us, and everyone benefits." Against her better judgment, Lyra agreed to accompany them to their base, a hidden compound nestled deep within a labyrinth of tunnels carved into the mountainside. As they walked, the rebels kept a close eye on her, their weapons never fully lowered. Kale stayed by her side, his presence a small comfort amidst the growing unease. At the base, they were greeted warmly by other members of the Free Hand, who seemed genuinely eager to meet Lyra. Stories of her exploits had spread among the rebels, painting her as a mythical figure capable of turning the tide against the Iron Veil. At first glance, it seemed like they had finally found sanctuary, food, shelter, camaraderie, all things they'd been deprived of for so long. But cracks began to show almost immediately. During a meeting with Rin and his inner circle, tensions flared when questions turned invasive. They demanded details about her abilities, her past battles, and the secrets she'd uncovered in the ruins. When she refused to answer, citing trust issues, Rin's patience wore thin. "You don't understand what's at stake here," he snapped, slamming his fist on the table. "Every day we waste is another victory for the Iron Veil. If you won't help us willingly, then maybe we'll have to find another way." Lyra stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You think you can control me? Use me like they did." "It's not about control," Rin countered, his voice icy. "It's about survival. Sometimes sacrifices must be made." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Hel stepped forward, placing himself between Lyra and Rin. "Enough. You brought us here under false pretenses. We're leaving." Before they could move, the doors slammed shut, and armed guards flooded the room. Lyra's glowing symbols flared brightly, illuminating the space as she prepared to fight. But before chaos erupted, Rin held up a hand, signaling for restraint. "I don't want bloodshed," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But I also can't let you walk away. Not after everything we've risked to bring you here." Ursation confirmed what Lyra already suspected. The device wasn't just amplifying powers. It was draining the life force of captured warriors, leaving them hollow shells. "They're monsters," Kale whispered, his fists clenched in anger. using people like tools, like you. Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. Focus, she said softly. We can't afford distractions. Finally, after hours of navigating the labyrinthine complex, they reached the heart of the fortress. A massive chamber dominated by the machine itself. It pulsed with an otherworldly glow, its core swirling with chaotic energy. Tubes and cables connected it to rows of pods containing unconscious figures, their bodies glowing faintly as if caught in some kind of limbo. It's worse than I imagined, Lyra murmured, her voice tinged with horror. This isn't just about control. It's about erasure. They're stripping away everything that makes us human. Cale stared at the machine, his resolve hardening. Then let's end it. But destroying the device wouldn't be easy. Guards patrolled the perimeter, and alarms blared constantly throughout the fortress. Working quickly, Lyra used her energy manipulation to disable nearby cameras, while Cale rigged makeshift explosives from components scavenged during their journey. Together, they planted charges around the machine's base, setting timers to give them enough time to escape. As they worked, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the chamber. Dozens of soldiers stormed in, led by none other than Rin. His expression was grim, his scared face twisted with fury. I should have known better than to trust you, he spat, leveling his weapon at Lyra. You've caused us enough trouble. Lyra stepped forward, her glowing symbols flaring brightly. And yet here I am, she said defiantly, still standing. A tense standoff ensued, with neither side willing to make the first move. Then, without warning, Lyra unleashed a burst of energy, sending shockwaves rippling through the room. Chaos erupted as soldiers scrambled to retaliate, but Cale and Lyra fought back with everything they had. Lyra's powers were unmatched, her strikes precise and devastating, while Cale relied on speed and cunning to outmaneuver their enemies. Despite their efforts, reinforcements poured in, overwhelming them. Just as it seemed all hope was lost, Lyra made a decision. Channeling every ounce of her strength, she created a barrier of energy around herself and Cale, shielding them from harm. The strain showed on her face, sweat dripping down her brow as she struggled to maintain the shield. Go, she shouted at Cale. Finish it. No, Cale protested, unwilling to leave her behind. We do this together. There's no time. Lyra insisted, her voice breaking slightly. Trust me, Cale. Please. Reluctantly, Cale obeyed, sprinting toward the machine as explosions rocked the chamber. With one final surge of determination, he activated the charges, triggering a chain reaction that engulfed the device in flames. The ground shook violently, debris raining down as the fortress began to collapse. Lyra released the barrier just in time to join Cale in their desperate retreat. Together, they raced through the chaos, dodging falling rubble and bursts of energy. Behind them, the machine imploded, its core collapsing into a fiery vortex that consumed everything in its path. They emerged into the open air mere seconds before the fortress crumbled entirely, collapsing into a smoldering ruin. Exhausted and battered, they collapsed onto the rocky terrain, watching as smoke billowed into the sky. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Cale turned to Lyra, his voice trembling with emotion. Did we do it? Lyra nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting both relief and sorrow. We did, but at a cost. Her words hung heavy in the air, a reminder of the sacrifices they'd made, and the battle still ahead. Yet amidst the destruction, there was a glimmer of hope. The Iron Veil's grip on the world had been weakened, and for the first time in years, the future felt uncertain, but not impossible. The aftermath of the fortress's destruction was chaos. Smoke billowed into the sky, painting the horizon in shades of gray and orange as embers rained down like dying stars. The ground beneath Cale and Lyra's feet trembled sporadically, aftershocks rippling through the earth as the ruins settled into silence. They lay there for what felt like hours, their bodies battered and bruised but alive. For a moment, neither spoke, They simply breathed, savoring the quiet that followed the storm. Finally, Cale broke the silence. "Is it over?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace around them. Lyra closed her eyes, listening intently to the distant echoes of collapse. The hum of energy that had once filled the air, the oppressive weight of the Iron Veil's dominance, was gone. In its place was emptiness, a void waiting to be filled. She opened her eyes, meeting Cal's gaze with a mixture of relief and resolve. "For now," she replied softly, "we've cut off their power source. Without the machine, they can't control or amplify living weapons anymore. But the Iron Veil isn't defeated. They're wounded, and wounded enemies are dangerous." Cale nodded grimly, understanding the gravity of her words. Destroying the machine hadn't ended the war. It had only shifted the battlefield. Still, there was no denying the significance of what they'd accomplished. For the first time in years, the oppressed masses might have a chance to rise up, to reclaim their freedom from the shadows of tyranny. As they rose to their feet, wincing at the pain coursing through their limbs, Lyra noticed something strange. Her glowing symbols, which had always pulsed steadily with an inner light, were dimming. At first, she thought it was exhaustion, a side effect of expending so much energy during the fight. But as she focused on them, she realized the truth. Her powers were fading. "What's happening?" Cale asked, noticing the change in her expression. Lyra hesitated, glancing down at her hands. The machine wasn't just amplifying powers, it was sustaining them. "My abilities. They were tied to it. Without it, I'm less than I was." Her voice carried no bitterness, only acceptance. Over centuries, she had been defined by her role as a warrior, a weapon forged for battle. Now, stripped of that identity, she felt strangely free, and yet uncertain about who she was without it. "You're still you," Cale said firmly, stepping closer. "You didn't need those powers to make a difference. You did this because of who you are, not what you can do." Lyra smiled faintly, touched by his words. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps being human wasn't about strength or invincibility. It was about connection, resilience, and hope. And if anyone had taught her that, it was Cale. A symbol of hope. Word of the fortress's destruction spread quickly, carried by survivors fleeing the ruins and rebels eager to rally against the weakened Iron Veil. Within days, makeshift camps began to spring up across the wasteland, banners bearing crude sketches of Lyra and Cale fluttering in the wind. To the people, they were more than fighters. They were symbols of defiance, proof that even the most powerful forces could be challenged. But fame brought challenges of its own. As Cale and Lyra traveled through the camps, offering guidance and support where they could, they found themselves torn between gratitude and unease. People looked to them for leadership, for answers, but both knew they weren't meant to lead. Their journey had never been about glory or recognition. It had been about survival, justice, and redemption. One evening, as they sat by a campfire surrounded by hopeful faces, a young girl approached Lyra timidly. She couldn't have been older than 10, her clothes patched and her hair matted with dirt. In her hands, she held a small wooden carving, a crude representation of a warrior clad in glowing armor. "For you," the girl said shyly, holding out the figure, "because you saved us." Lyra took the carving gently, her throat tightening with emotion. She knelt down to meet the girl's gaze, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't do this alone. None of us can change the world by ourselves. It takes everyone working together." The girl nodded solemnly, clutching Lyra's hand before running back to her family. Watching her go, Cale placed a reassuring hand on Lyra's shoulder. "She's right, you know. You did save them. All of them."